Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. As you probably know, I'm a history buff, and one year which has always fascinated me has been the low CO2 year of 1921. In 1921, the New York Times said that Earth had a fever. New York Times, October 3rd, 1921. Freak weather laid to earthly mumps. Old spheroid convalescing, say diagnosticians, but fever clings with abnormal heat. New record for 50 years. Many disasters of recent months ascribed to high temperatures and lack of moisture. The old spheroid known as the Earth is emerging from what some human diagnosticians might call a severe attack of meteorological mumps. It's been accompanied by an intermittent fever manifested in a worldwide heat wave of unusual length and intensity. In spite of crises and relapses, earthquakes, tidal waves, cloudbursts, typhoons, waterspouts, hailstorms, floods, and hurricanes in many widely separated parts, from Kamchatka to Cape Horn and from Guam to Guadeloupe, doctors are confident the patient will recover. Meanwhile, the United States for the last year has been suffering chiefly from an excess to high temperature and a deficiency of moisture. During September 1921, the New York Herald reported that the heat wave and resultant famine in Europe was likely to bring death to millions. This full-page ad from Save the Children appeared in the Times of London. Our Empire Day duty to millions of starving, dying children. Shall the British flag fly in Europe while thousands of helpless little ones die every day? The most urgent, most pitiful appeal ever made to British generosity. Every citizen of the empire implored to spare something to save the children from dying of hunger. 100 years ago was the low CO2 world which people like Greta and Bernie Sanders dream of. Bernie Sanders wants to spend $16 trillion to bring us back to the horrible climate of a century ago. And this horrible heat wave, drought, and famine came right on the heels of the worst pandemic in human history. During 1918 and 1919, the Spanish flu killed something like 50 million people. Unlike most flus, most of the dead weren't elderly and babies, but rather was people right in their prime. And this flu pandemic came right at the end of the deadliest war in world history, World War I. Needless to say, people had more serious things to think about at the time than tiny increases in essential trace gases. Now let's look at the data. This is the average daily maximum temperature at all U.S. historical climatology network stations going back to the year 1900. As you can see, maximum temperatures have been declining in the United States for well over a century. Also note that afternoon temperatures in the U.S. over the past 60 years have been much lower than they were during the previous 60 years. The warmest year was 1934, and the second warmest year was 1921. This graph is a little different. It shows the percent of days above 60 degrees Fahrenheit rather than the average maximum temperature. You can see that the frequency of warm days has also been declining in the United States, and the peak year was 1921, with more than 2/3 of days above 60 degrees Fahrenheit. So we can see from this graph that 1921 brought persistent warmth throughout much of the year. This graph is the same except it was for 80-degree days instead of 60-degree days. 1921 was fourth highest for the percent of days over 80 degrees. All of the hottest years occurred during the 1930s. Also note that the frequency of 80-degree days has been much lower over the past 60 years. And this is the same graph for 90-degree days. Note that the hottest year by far was 1936. 1921 had a lot of 90-degree days, but it wasn't even in the top 10. So what we can interpret from these graphs is that 1921 had very persistent heat, but not necessarily extreme heat. Also note that the frequency of 90-degree days in the United States over the past 60 years has been much lower than it was during the previous 60 years. Now let's zoom in and look specifically at temperatures in one state, Texas. This is a graph of the average mean temperature in Texas going back to the year 1900. You can see that 1921 was by far the warmest year in Texas. Texas cooled sharply from the early part of the 20th century until about 1980. Since 1980, Texas has been warming up again, but it's not as warm now as it was back in the 1920s. The graph I'm showing you is the actual measured data, which shows a long-term decline in Texas temperatures. But the graph which the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration releases to the public looks very different. It shows a long-term increase in Texas temperatures. The NOAA graph used to look fairly similar to mine, but sometime between the year 2011 and 2015, they altered the data to turn a long-term cooling trend into a warming trend. This animation flashes back and forth between the official graph from 2011 and the official graph from 2015. This sort of data tampering occurred at a lot of states during the Obama administration. To get a feel for how warm Texas was in 1921, Falfurrias, Texas was over 60 degrees every single day except for one during that year. This graph plots daily maximum temperatures at Falfurrias for every day during 1921. Peak temperatures in Falfurrias during 1921 weren't all that high. They only got up to 104 degrees, but the heat during that year was very persistent. And the heat wasn't just in Texas in 1921. It was all over the United States and much of the world. There was an incredible heat wave in the United States at the end of winter in 1921. Omaha, Nebraska reached 85 degrees on March 18th. And on March 21, 1921, Boston reached 82 degrees on the last day of winter. New York City was 80 degrees that day. In June there was massive flooding. The worst flooding in Colorado history occurred that year. On June 3, 1921, Pueblo, Colorado was destroyed by several flash floods. The water was as deep as 15 feet, and 1,500 people died in the flooding that day. The city was left in complete ruins, and then the flooding moved downstream and did huge amounts of damage in Kansas. Then the Colorado flooding was followed by record summer heat waves in the United States, Europe, and Russia. Even Alaska was hit by the heat wave. This article is from the Cincinnati Enquirer, August 1, 1921. Even Alaska in these torrid days would offer but slight relief, Professor Mitchell said. As far north as the Arctic Circle, the mercury has ranged throughout the last 60 days around 75 degrees and upwards as high as 80 degrees Fahrenheit. He said this almost is unprecedented and is due to causes for which there is no scientific explanation. At Nome, Alaska, and other cities and towns in that zone, the thermometer has shown readings not much below the 75-degree mark for 2 months. If Alaska had weather that warm now, climate scientists would say they're 100% certain that weather like that couldn't have occurred at lower CO2 levels, like they had in 1921. In 1921, these scientists were honest enough to admit that they didn't understand the cause of the hot weather. But now they have an easy way out. They simply blame everything on carbon dioxide, which saves them the trouble of having to do any actual research or thinking. The years leading up to 1921 were extremely difficult around the world. And not surprisingly, the food famine in Europe was also accompanied by an energy famine. New York Tribune, September 15, 1919. Coal famine in Europe certain, says Goodyear. Even if all the Central European miners were to work on 2 shifts of 9 hours daily, a coal famine in Europe this winter could not be prevented. People at the time did not fear having coal. What they feared was not having the energy they needed to stay alive. Fear of coal is a modern decadence, only for people whose lives are very comfortable and they have too much time on their hands. The low CO2 climate of 100 years ago was not something to be envied. One of my goals is to help end the superstition that lower CO2 levels would bring better weather. There is no historical evidence to support that idea. Energy means life, and we should all be very grateful on Thanksgiving Day that we have an adequate supply of fossil fuels. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.